Ivy Bennet woke to the sound of breathing that was not her own. She lay still under her thin blanket, eyes open in the dark, counting the shapes pressed against the small kitchen window above her cot. 4 of them, maybe 5, shoulders too broad for men, too still for dogs, fur catching the last light of the moon like frost on stone. She did not move. She did not scream. Screaming, she had learned in 3 months of working in the stronghold kitchens, brought attention, and attention was the one thing a servant girl with no family and no name worth mentioning could not afford. The wolves did not come closer. They only watched, the way a person watches a fire they are not allowed to touch. Then, one by one, they turned and slipped back into the trees beyond the courtyard wall, and Ivy was alone again with her heartbeat and the smell of yesterday's bread still hanging in the air. She did not tell anyone, not right away. It had started 3 weeks earlier, though she had not understood it as a beginning. She had been kneading dough before dawn, half asleep, humming a tune her mother used to sing before the fever took her, before the debts took the house, before Ivy had walked 2 days to reach the gates of King Callum's stronghold with nothing but a bundle of clothes and a letter of recommendation that turned out to mean nothing at all. The head cook, a broad, no-nonsense woman named Nora, had given her a place in the kitchens anyway, out of something that might have been pity or might have simply been need for more hands. Ivy scrubbed pots. She carried water. She burned her fingers on hot pans and learned to swallow the pain without a sound, because sound cost time, and time cost trouble. The singing was the only thing that was hers. She had not noticed, at first, that the kitchen dogs no longer barked at her. She had not noticed that on nights she sang softest, the courtyard beyond the kitchen door grew strangely quiet, as if the whole world outside had stopped to listen. She noticed only that she felt, sometimes, a prickling at the back of her neck, the sensation of being watched by something patient and old, something that did not want anything from her except to keep singing. It was Grace, a serving girl 2 years older than Ivy, with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, who finally said it out loud. "You know they gather for you," Grace whispered one evening, both of them elbow-deep in wash-water. "The wolves, out by the kitchen wall." Ivy's hands stilled in the basin. "They gather for the scraps we throw out. There are no scraps tonight. Nora burned the stew, remember? Nothing to throw. They're still out there." Grace glanced toward the door, voice dropping lower. "I've seen the king's own beta among them. Finn. He doesn't come near the kitchens for food, Ivy. He's pack. He eats better than either of us." Ivy's stomach turned in a way she did not have a name for. "That doesn't mean anything." "It means everything," Grace said. "You don't hum a tune that pulls half the king's pack out of their beds and call it nothing." Ivy told herself Grace was exaggerating, the way she always did, turning gossip into something bigger than it was, because the kitchens were dull, and gossip was the only entertainment allowed to girls like them. But that night, when she sang low over the dying fire while she scraped the last pot clean, she watched the window instead of the pot, and she saw the shape of a wolf, sitting just beyond the glass, utterly motionless, ears turned toward her, like a man leaning in to catch every word of a story he was afraid to miss. She stopped singing at once. The wolf did not leave. It sat a moment longer, as if waiting for her to start again, and when she did not, it rose without hurry and walked back into the dark, unbothered, patient, the way something walks away when it already knows it will return. She did not sleep well after that. In the stronghold above the kitchens, in a hall built from cold stone and colder silence, King Callum Ashford stood at the window of his private chamber, with his arms crossed and his jaw tight, staring down at the courtyard wall, where his own wolf had, without his permission, dragged him twice that week. He did not go easily. He was a man who had built his rule on control, on the iron discipline that kept a pack of nearly 400 wolves from tearing each other apart over territory and pride. He had buried a mate once, years ago, in the aftermath of a border war that still woke him some nights with the smell of smoke in his throat. Since then he had not let himself want anything he could lose. Wanting was a door, and doors could be broken down. But his wolf did not care about doors. His wolf cared about a voice drifting out of the kitchen windows at odd hours, a voice that did something to the animal part of him he could not explain and refused to examine too closely. He had gone twice now, in wolf form, slipping out through the old servant's gate like a thief in his own home, to stand in the dark and listen to a girl he had never met sing songs that sounded like they belonged to a life gentler than any he had lived. "You are the king," he told himself under his breath, watching the empty courtyard now that the singing had stopped. "You do not skulk around kitchen walls like some lovesick pup." His wolf, deep inside him, did not agree. A knock came at his door. Finn entered without waiting to be told, as was his right as beta and oldest friend the king had left in the world. He took one look at Callum's face, then at the window, then back at Callum's face, and something like amusement flickered across his features before he wisely smothered it. "You went out again," Finn said. "It was not a question." "I did not. Your boots are wet from the courtyard grass, and it hasn't rained in 4 days." Finn crossed his arms, mirroring the king's stance with the ease of a man who had earned the right to needle him. "The wolves talk, Callum, even when you don't. Half the pack has been slipping down to that wall like it's the only interesting thing in the stronghold. It's a kitchen wall. It's a kitchen wall with a girl on the other side of it, whose voice makes grown wolves forget they're supposed to be guarding the perimeter." Finn's amusement faded into something more careful. "You know what that usually means." Callum's jaw tightened further. "It means nothing. Coincidence. A pretty voice, and bored wolves with nothing better to do. 400 wolves don't get bored in the same direction, at the same time by coincidence," Finn said quietly. "You know that better than anyone." The king said nothing. Below, the courtyard sat empty and dark, the kitchen window unlit now, the girl inside it presumably asleep, unaware that above her, in a cold stone room, a king who had sworn off wanting anything was standing very still, trying and failing to convince himself that what he felt pulling him toward that window was nothing at all. Ivy woke the next morning before the sun, as she always did, and found Nora already awake in the kitchen, arms folded, watching her with an expression Ivy could not quite read. It was not an accusation exactly, but it was not entirely comfortable either. "I didn't know I did that." "You didn't used to." Nora turned back to the ovens, her broad shoulders set in a way that told Ivy the conversation was not finished, only postponed. "Keep the windows shut at night from now on. It's getting colder." It was not getting colder. Ivy knew a lie of convenience when she heard one, the way every servant learned to hear the true shape of things beneath the words meant to smooth them over. But she nodded and said nothing, because that was what she had always done, and because some small frightened part of her was starting to understand that the wolves gathering outside her window were not the strangest thing happening to her. The strangest thing was that some nights, when she sang, she did not feel alone in the world for the first time since her mother died, and she did not know yet whether that feeling was a gift or the beginning of something she would not be able to take back. That evening, as the last light drained out of the sky and the kitchen quieted around her, Ivy found herself standing at the window she had been told to keep shut, looking out at the empty courtyard, and before she could stop herself, before she could remember all the reasons a girl like her should keep her voice small and her head down, she opened her mouth and sang anyway. Within minutes, the wall beyond the courtyard was lined with eyes catching the moonlight, patient and unmoving, waiting for a voice that did not yet know it belonged to more than one story. She sang the whole way through the old song about a fisherman's daughter waiting for a ship that never came home, and by the time she finished, her arms had gone cold with gooseflesh, though the kitchen fire still burned warm behind her. She turned from the window at last, half expecting the wolves to have vanished the moment her voice stopped, the way a dream vanishes the moment eyes open. They had not vanished. They sat exactly where they had been, a loose half-circle just beyond the low wall, heads tilted, ears forward, as still as carved stone. One of them, larger than the rest, dark-furred and broad through the shoulders, stood apart from the others, near the old servant's gate. Ivy could not have said how she knew, but she felt certain that one was watching only her, and not the window, and not the kitchen light, But her, the way a person studies a puzzle they suspect has an answer they are not ready to hear. She backed away from the glass and pulled the shutter closed, hands trembling slightly, though whether from cold or something else, she did not examine too closely. Behind her, Nora's voice came dry and knowing from the doorway. "I told you to keep that shut." "I know. And yet." Ivy said nothing, because there was nothing honest she could say that would not sound foolish. Nora crossed the kitchen, glanced once at the shuttered window, and let out a breath that carried more worry in it than irritation. "Whatever this is," the older woman said, "it isn't nothing, girl. You'd do well to understand that before it decides to understand you first." Ivy did not sleep easily that night, turning the words over long after the fire had burned down to embers, wondering what exactly it was that a kitchen wall full of silent wolves could want from a girl who owned nothing in the world but a voice she had never once thought to be afraid of. The tray hit the floor before Ivy even realized her hands had let go of it. Hot broth spread across the stone in a dark tide, and 3 loaves of bread rolled toward the doorway like they were trying to escape the mess along with her. She dropped to her knees, reaching for the nearest loaf, when a pair of boots stepped into her narrow line of sight, boots far too fine for anyone who belonged in a kitchen. "You'll want to move your hand," a low voice said, "before I step on it." Ivy looked up, and up, past a plain gray coat with no crest or crown stitched anywhere on it, past a jaw shadowed with a day's stubble, into a pair of eyes so dark they looked less like a color and more like a warning. The man was tall in the particular way that made a room feel smaller. He did not look like a soldier. He did not look like a servant either. He looked like something in between that had wandered into the wrong story by mistake. "You're in my kitchen," Ivy said, because it was the only thought her scattered mind could produce, and because she was too startled to remember she was not supposed to speak to strangers in that tone, whoever they were. Something flickered across his face, brief and almost amused. "Is that what this is?" "You're tracking mud across my floor," she said, pointing at the trail of boot prints leading in from the courtyard door, mud she would be scrubbing for the next hour on top of the broth. "Nora will have my head if this isn't spotless by morning." "Then I suppose I owe you an apology." He crouched, unhurried, and began gathering the fallen bread himself, setting each loaf back onto the tray with a care that seemed out of place on a man built like a wall. Up close, Ivy noticed the old pale scar along the edge of his left hand and the way his eyes kept drifting to her face and then away, as though he were checking something against a memory he could not quite place. "You don't need to do that," she said, reaching for the last loaf at the same moment he did. Their hands brushed. It was nothing, the smallest accident of proximity, but something in her chest jumped like a struck bell, and across from her, the man went very still, his breath catching audibly enough that she heard it. "Are you all right?" she asked, because his stillness looked less like courtesy and more like shock. "Fine," he said, too quickly. He straightened, tray in hand, and held it out to her with the awkward formality of someone unused to holding trays at all. "You should be more careful where you walk. The floors here are treacherous." "The floors are fine. It was the mud." She took the tray back, studying him properly now that the panic of the spill had passed. He did not carry himself like anyone she had served before, and there was something in the set of his shoulders, tense and deliberate, that reminded her uncomfortably of the wolves at the wall, patient, watchful, holding something back. "Who are you?" "You're not one of the guards." "No," he agreed, "I'm not." "Then what business does a man in a coat like that have wandering into the servant's kitchen at this hour?" He seemed to consider several answers before settling on the simplest one. "Curiosity." "About the mess on my floor?" "About the voice that comes from this window most nights." He said it plainly, without apology, watching her reaction the way a man watches weather he cannot control, but needs to understand. "I wanted to see who it belonged to." Ivy's grip on the tray tightened. "You're one of them, aren't you?" "The ones who gather at the wall." "Something like that. Do you have a name, or do I just call you the one who gathers?" The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but close enough to it that Ivy felt the strange, unwelcome urge to see it finish the job. "Callum," he said. It took her a moment longer than it should have to place the name against everything she had heard whispered through the kitchen since she arrived. The king's name spoken in careful, respectful tones by people who had never once described him, standing in a servant's kitchen with mud on his boots and crumbs in his hand. The tray very nearly went down a second time. "You're the king," she said, the words coming out flatter than she intended, disbelief flattening them on the way out. "I am. The king is standing in my kitchen, at this hour, picking up bread. It appears so." He did not look remotely embarrassed by the fact, which somehow made it worse. "Should I apologize for that as well?" Ivy set the tray down with great care on the nearest table, mostly to give her hands something to do that was not shaking. Every instinct she had built over 3 months of careful, invisible service screamed at her to bow, to apologize, to disappear from his notice as quickly as possible, because kings did not linger in kitchens for girls, with nothing to offer them but burnt fingers and a voice that apparently drew wolves out of the trees like moths to flame. But something about the way he watched her, waiting rather than commanding, kept her feet planted where they were. "Why are you really here?" she said. "Your Majesty." The title sat strangely between them, too formal for the mud on his boots, too formal for the way his gaze had not left her face since he had stood. "I told you," he said, "curiosity. About my singing. About what my pack does when you sing." He crossed his arms, and for the first time since he had entered, something like discomfort crossed his features. A man circling a subject he did not fully want to name. "You should know that it isn't ordinary, what happens outside this window. Wolves do not gather for a pleasant tune. They gather for very few things, and none of them are small." Ivy's heart, which had only just begun to settle, picked up its pace again. "What things?" "Territory. Danger." He paused, and the pause stretched long enough that Ivy understood the third thing was the one he had come to say, and did not want to. "Family." "I don't have a family here," she said. "I don't have one anywhere, if it comes to that." Something shifted behind his eyes, quick and complicated, gone before she could name it. "That may be about to change, whether either of us wishes it or not." Before she could ask what he meant, the kitchen door swung open behind him, and Nora entered with an armful of firewood, stopping dead in the doorway at the sight of the king of the stronghold standing amid a puddle of spilled broth with crumbs on his sleeve. The wood clattered to the floor. Nora's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and finally produced a strangled, "Your Majesty," followed immediately by a bow, so fast it looked almost painful. "Nora," Callum said, with the easy familiarity of a man who had clearly known the head cook far longer than 3 months. "I was just leaving." "Of course, Your Majesty, of course." Nora's eyes cut sideways to Ivy, sharp and searching, before returning to the king with the practiced neutrality of a woman who had survived a long career by knowing exactly when to see nothing at all. Callum turned back to Ivy one last time before he crossed to the door, and whatever careful mask he had been wearing slipped just slightly, long enough for her to see something underneath it that looked almost like fear, though kings were not supposed to be capable of such a plain and human thing. "Keep your window shut tonight," he said quietly, echoing Nora's own warning from days before, though his reasons, Ivy suspected, ran far deeper than the cold. "Please." Then he was gone, boots tracking one last line of mud across the floor she would now be scrubbing twice, and Ivy stood alone in the ruined remains of the evening meal, her pulse refusing to slow, her mind turning over every word he had said and every word he had clearly swallowed instead. Nora did not ask questions that night, though her silence carried the particular weight of a woman holding back an entire storm of them. She simply handed Ivy a rag, nodded toward the mess, and set to work beside her without a word, the two of them scrubbing the floor clean in the low firelight, while, outside, the courtyard sat unusually and pointedly empty, as though even the wolves understood that tonight, for once, they were not welcome to listen in. It was only much later, lying in the dark with the shutter bolted tight against the cold and everything else the night might bring, that Ivy allowed herself to admit the truth she had been avoiding since the moment their hands brushed over a fallen loaf of bread. She had felt something in that instant that had nothing to do with fear, something warm and unwelcome and entirely inconvenient, and whatever it was, she suspected the king had felt it too, in the way his breath had caught, and his careful composure had cracked just slightly at the seams. She told herself it meant nothing. She did not believe it, not even a little, but she told herself anyway, because believing otherwise meant admitting that the quiet, ordinary life she had built for herself in this kitchen, the one where she was small and unseen and safe, might already be slipping through her fingers like water she had never learned to hold. The next morning brought a summons she had not expected. A young pack member named Owen, barely older than Ivy herself, appeared at the kitchen door just after sunrise and informed her, with the stiff discomfort of someone delivering news well above his station, that the king wished to see her in the east garden before the midday meal. Nora's hands stilled over the bread dough. Did he say why? No, ma'am, only that it wasn't a request. Ivy wiped the flour from her hands and followed Owen out through corridors she had never been permitted to walk, past guards who watched her with open curiosity, into a garden bordered by high stone walls where morning light fell soft and gold over rows of late-season roses. Callum stood near a fountain at the garden's center, alone, his back to her, shoulders set in the same tense line she remembered from the kitchen the night before. "You wanted to see me," she said, stopping a careful distance away. He turned, and whatever he had planned to say seemed to catch somewhere behind his teeth the moment his eyes found her. For a long moment neither of them spoke, the fountain water the only sound between them, and Ivy felt, not for the first time since meeting him, that she was standing far closer to the edge of something enormous than she had any right to be. "I owe you an explanation," Callum said finally. "About the wolves, about why they gather, about why I have not been able to stop thinking about a servant girl's singing voice since the first night I heard it, when every instinct I have built my entire rule around tells me that is a very foolish thing for a king to admit." Ivy's breath caught somewhere in her chest and refused to move on. "Then explain it," she said, quiet, steady, though her pulse was doing anything but. "I would like, for once, to understand what is happening to me before it finishes happening without my permission." Callum studied her for a long moment, and something in his expression, careful and unguarded all at once, told her that whatever he said next would change the shape of her life, whether she was ready for it or not. "Ivy Bennett." Grace's voice cracked across the kitchen loud enough to send a pan clattering off its hook. "There is a wolf sitting in the doorway. Not the courtyard, the doorway." Ivy spun from the wash basin to find a great gray shape filling the frame of the kitchen entrance, tongue lolling, tail sweeping lazily across the floor Ivy had just mopped. She recognized the pale marking above its left eye at once. Owen. He had taken to shifting halfway through his rounds and simply lying down near the kitchen threshold as though he had every right to nap there, which, given the last 2 weeks, he apparently did. "Get up," Ivy said, not unkindly. "You're blocking the door, and Nora will trip over you carrying the flour." Owen thumped his tail once, unbothered, and did not move. It had become, in the space of a fortnight, an almost ordinary sight. Since the morning in the garden, since Callum had told her plainly and without softening it that her voice was not simply pleasant to wolf ears, but something closer to a calling, a sound their instincts read the way a starving man reads the smell of bread, the pack had stopped bothering to hide their interest at all. They lingered near the kitchen door in wolf form during the day, ostensibly on patrol, and gathered at the courtyard wall by night, in numbers that had grown rather than shrunk, despite Ivy's best efforts to sing only when she thought no one was listening. She had not managed to stop entirely. She had tried, but some habits, it turned out, were older and stronger than fear, and her mother's songs were the only inheritance she had left. "They're not just curious anymore," Grace said, once Owen had finally ambled off toward the courtyard with visible reluctance. "Have you noticed? They're guarding you. Ellie saw two of them walk you back from the well yesterday, at a distance, like they thought you needed watching over. I can watch over myself, Ivy said, though even as she said it, she remembered the strange, prickling awareness she had felt on the path from the well the day before. The sense of being flanked by something unseen but entirely present, and how, instead of frightening her, it had felt oddly like being tucked into a warm coat on a cold day. That's not the point, Grace said. The point is a king's pack does not guard a kitchen girl for no reason, Ivy. Whatever this is, it isn't small anymore. People are starting to talk, not just servants either. I heard two of the king's council arguing about it near the West Hall this morning. Ivy's stomach tightened. Arguing about what? About you, Grace said simply. About whether it's wise for a king with no fated bond to his name in years to be circling a human servant with no pack, no name, no claim to anything. One of the older men, Counselor Bryant, called it a liability, said it loud enough that half the corridor heard him. Ivy did not know what to do with the word liability, turning it over the way she had turned over so many strange new words since arriving at the stronghold, testing its weight, trying to understand how it applied to her, a girl who had scrubbed pots and slept in a kitchen cot and wanted, more than anything, simply to be left in peace to grieve her mother and build some small, quiet life for herself. She had not asked for wolves at her window. She had not asked for a king with careful, unguarded eyes and a scar on his hand and a voice that made her forget, for whole minutes at a time, that she was supposed to be afraid of him. She had certainly not asked to become a liability discussed behind closed doors by men who had never once spoken a word to her directly. That evening, as the last of the kitchen fires died down and the courtyard beyond the window filled with its now familiar gathering of silent shapes, Ivy noticed something new among them. A stranger, a wolf she did not recognize, leaner and paler than any of Callum's pack, sitting apart from the others near the tree line, watching not the kitchen window, but the wolves gathered before it, with an intensity that had nothing to do with music at all. She did not sing that night. Instinct, sharp and sudden, told her not to. The stranger remained until nearly dawn, then vanished into the trees without a sound, and Ivy lay awake long after, certain in a way she could not explain that whatever had come to watch the watchers had not come out of curiosity and had not come alone. She told Callum the next day, catching him in the corridor outside the kitchens with Finn at his side, both men mid-conversation that stopped the moment they saw her face. "A wolf," Callum repeated, once she had finished. Pale coat, thin build, kept to the tree line. "He wasn't watching me," Ivy said. "He was watching your pack, studying them, counting them, almost." Finn's expression had gone flat and serious, in a way Ivy had not seen from him before. He exchanged a look with Callum that carried an entire conversation neither of them spoke aloud. "Silas," Finn said finally, quiet. Callum's jaw set hard enough that a muscle jumped along it. He wouldn't dare send a scout this close to the stronghold walls. "He's dared closer for less," Finn said, "and if word of what's happening here has reached his territory, a servant girl who calls half your pack to a kitchen window every night is exactly the kind of weakness he'd want confirmed with his own eyes before he moved on it." Ivy looked between the two men, the easy warmth she had grown used to in Callum's face replaced now by something colder, more calculating, a king's face rather than a man's. "Who is Silas?" "An alpha with territory, 2 days' ride from here," Callum said, "and an old grudge against this pack that predates my rule and will likely outlast it. He has wanted a reason to test our borders for years, if he believes I have grown distracted." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. "You think I'm a distraction," Ivy said, and hated how small her voice sounded saying it, hated more that it was, in some way, exactly true. "I think," Callum said, choosing his words with visible care, "that you are the first thing in a very long time that has made me want to be less careful than I know how to be. And I think that is precisely the kind of weakness men like Silas are trained to smell from 2 days away." The words should have frightened her more than they did. Instead, standing in a cold stone corridor with a king who looked, for the first time since she had known him, genuinely afraid of something other than his own feelings. Ivy felt something steady and stubborn settle into her chest instead of the terror she expected. "Then don't be careless," she said. "Be ready instead." Finn's eyebrows rose slightly, something like approval crossing his face, before he smoothed it away. Callum, for his part, studied her the way he had studied her in the garden weeks before, as though she kept surprising him in ways he had stopped expecting from anyone. "I will double the watch along the eastern wall," Finn said, "and send word to the border scouts to report anything unusual." "Do it quietly," Callum said. "I don't want the council seizing on this as proof of exactly the argument they've already started making in the West Hall." Finn nodded once and left, and for a moment Ivy and Callum stood alone in the corridor, the weight of everything unsaid pressing between them, heavier now than it had been even in the garden, when the only danger either of them had been discussing was the danger of wanting something they were not sure they were allowed to keep. "Ivy," Callum's voice had lost its careful, kingly edge, dropping into something rawer. "If Silas has truly sent a scout this close, it means he already suspects there is a weakness here worth exploiting. I need you to be careful. More careful than you have been. No unnecessary trips beyond the walls. No windows left open at night, whatever the temptation to sing." "You're asking me to stop being myself," she said, though she understood, even as the words left her mouth, that this was not quite fair. He was not asking her to stop being herself. He was asking her to survive long enough to keep being herself at all, and there was a difference, however much her pride wanted to blur the line between them. "I'm asking you to trust that I would rather have you frightened and safe than brave and gone," he said, and something in the plain honesty of it disarmed her more thoroughly than any careful kingly speech could have managed. She did not sing that night, nor the next, and the courtyard beyond her window sat unusually crowded regardless, wolves gathering not for music now but for watch, a silent ring of guardians around a girl who had never asked to be worth guarding and was beginning, slowly, to understand that she no longer had a choice in the matter. It was Nora who found her 3 nights later, standing rigid at the shuttered window, listening to something Ivy could not quite explain, a wrongness in the quality of the silence outside, that prickled at the back of her neck the way it had the very first night the wolves gathered. "What is it?" Nora asked, low. "I don't know," Ivy admitted. "Something's different. It's too quiet, even for wolves trying to be quiet." Nora crossed to the window herself, easing the shutter open a careful crack, and together they looked out into a courtyard that held no wolves at all, not one, the wall standing empty and dark for the first time in weeks, as though every guard that had gathered there each night had been called away at once, urgently, without warning. Ivy's blood went cold. "Wake the king," she said, already reaching for the door. "Now." Nora did not argue. She simply ran, and Ivy followed, her heart pounding louder than any song she had ever sung, certain in her bones that whatever had emptied that courtyard in a single silent instant was not a retreat, but the beginning of something the whole stronghold was about to feel. Callum was already awake when Nora reached his chamber, already dressed, already moving, as though some part of him had felt the courtyard empty before anyone came to tell him. Finn met them in the hall, bare-chested and pulling on a shirt as he ran, 3 other pack members falling into step behind him without needing to be told what was happening. "Eastern wall," Finn said, before Callum could ask. 2 of the watch went dark 10 minutes ago. No signal, no sound, just gone. Gone as in retreated, or gone as in taken. Callum's voice had dropped into something Ivy had not heard from him before, flat and cold and entirely certain, the voice of a man who had led wolves into danger more times than he ever spoke of. "We don't know yet. Then we find out." Callum turned toward Ivy, and for one brief moment, the king vanished entirely, replaced by the man who had crouched on a kitchen floor gathering spilled bread, worry plain and unguarded on his face. "Stay with Nora. Bolt every door between here and the kitchens. Do not open them for anyone whose voice you do not know. Do you understand me?" "I understand," Ivy said, though everything in her wanted to argue, wanted to ask what she could do besides hide, wanted absurdly to offer the only weapon she had ever known how to use, her voice, though she understood, even as the thought formed, that a song was no match for teeth and claws in the dark. Callum did not wait for further argument. He was already moving, already shedding his composure like a coat he no longer needed, and Ivy watched from the corridor window as he crossed the courtyard at a dead run alongside Finn and the others. 4 men who became, before they reached the tree line, 4 wolves instead, dark shapes merging into the deeper dark of the forest beyond the wall. The waiting was worse than anything Ivy had imagined it would be. She sat with Nora in the locked kitchen, both women silent, listening to a night that offered nothing but wind and the occasional distant sound, too faint to identify, a night that stretched on in a way that made every minute feel carved from stone. Grace joined them partway through, having heard the commotion from her own quarters, and the 3 of them sat together around the dying fire, none of them speaking the fear plainly sitting in the room with them. It was nearly an hour before the courtyard filled with sound again, boots and low voices, and the particular controlled urgency of men who had faced something and survived it, but were not yet certain the danger had fully passed. Ivy was at the door before Nora could stop her, throwing back the bolt, despite every instruction she had been given, because some instinct older than obedience told her Callum was on the other side of it, and needed to see with his own eyes that she was safe before either of them could breathe properly again. He was bloodied along one arm, a shallow claw mark that had already begun to close in the strange, quick way pack wounds did, and his eyes found her the instant the door opened, relief crossing his face so plainly that Ivy felt it land in her own chest like something physical. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing." He crossed the threshold, and for one unguarded moment, in front of Nora, Grace, Finn, and half a dozen exhausted pack members, reached out and pressed his palm briefly against the side of her face, as though needing to confirm with touch what his eyes had already told him. "You're all right. That's all that matters tonight." "What happened out there?" Finn answered before Callum could, his voice grim. "A scouting party. 3 of them, moving along the tree line near the eastern wall. We caught 2. The 3rd got away before we could close on him." "Silas's men?" Ivy asked. "His colors," Finn confirmed. No mistaking it. Callum's jaw tightened, the brief softness that had crossed his face at the sight of Ivy hardening back into something more careful, more calculating. Then he knows now what he suspected before, that there is something here worth testing us over. "What do we do?" Ivy asked, and the question came out steadier than she felt, though beneath the steadiness her whole body still trembled faintly with the aftermath of fear she had not fully allowed herself to feel until this exact moment, safe, with his hand still warm against her cheek. "We prepare," Callum said, "and we do not let him see anything resembling weakness again, not fear, not distraction, nothing he can use." His eyes found hers, and something passed between them that was equal parts apology and resolve, which means, for now, the wall stays quiet. No singing, no gatherings, nothing that tells a man like Silas exactly where to aim if he decides testing our borders isn't enough for him anymore. Ivy understood, even as the request settled heavy and unwelcome in her chest, that he was not asking her to disappear. He was asking her to survive a season of careful silence, so that whatever this was between them, whatever strange and inconvenient thing had grown from a voice drifting through a kitchen window, might have a chance to become something neither of them had to hide or apologize for ever again. "All right," she said quietly. Quiet then. For now. But even as she said it, standing in a doorway with a wounded king's hand still warm against her skin, and the whole stronghold humming with the particular tension of a threat not yet fully understood, Ivy suspected that silence was a promise the world outside these walls had no intention of letting either of them keep for very long. The silence lasted 11 days, and it cost Ivy more than she expected it to. She had not realized how much of herself lived inside the songs until she stopped singing them, how the humming under her breath while she worked had become something closer to breathing than performance, something she did not choose so much as need. Without it, the kitchen felt smaller, the days felt longer. She scrubbed pots in a silence that pressed against her ribs like a held breath, and Nora, watching her from across the room, said nothing, though her eyes carried a worry she did not bother hiding. Callum came to the kitchens less during those 11 days, not from any lack of wanting to, Ivy suspected, but because Finn and the council both agreed that a king seen too often near a servant girl's door was exactly the kind of detail a border war did not need feeding into it. When he did come, it was briefly, quietly, a few stolen minutes near the courtyard wall after the kitchen had emptied for the night, both of them speaking in the low, careful tones of people who understood they were being watched by more than wolves now. It was on the 11th night, in one of those stolen quiet minutes, that he finally told her the rest of it, the part he had circled around in the garden weeks before and never quite finished saying. "There's something else," he said, staring at the dark tree line rather than at her, the way a man stares at anything except the thing he is actually afraid of, "about what your voice does to my pack." Ivy waited, saying nothing, some instinct warning her that whatever came next would not be small. "Wolves do not gather like that for just any pleasant sound," he said. "I told you that already. What I did not tell you is what it usually means when they do." He turned to face her fully now, and the careful composure he wore like armor most days had thinned enough that she could see, underneath it, something that looked almost like fear. "It means the voice belongs to someone the pack recognizes as bound to their alpha, not by choice, not by ceremony, by instinct older than either of us." Ivy's chest went very still. "You're saying they think I'm your mate." "I'm saying," Callum said, quiet and careful, "that I think it too, and have for weeks, and have been too much of a coward to say so plainly, because saying it plainly means admitting I have wanted something again, after telling myself for years that wanting was a door I would not open twice." The words landed in Ivy like stones dropped into still water, rings spreading outward long after the stones themselves had sunk from sight. She thought of every night the wolves had gathered, every prickling awareness of being watched, every strange warmth that had settled in her chest at Callum's hand against her cheek, and understood, all at once, that none of it had been coincidence or curiosity at all. It had been recognition, something in her, something she had never asked for and did not fully understand, had been calling to his pack since the very first night she sang, and none of them, not the wolves, not Finn, not even Callum himself, had been able to help but answer. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to, caught somewhere between wonder and something closer to betrayal. "Because I was afraid of exactly this," he said. "Of watching you look at me the way you're looking at me right now, like I've taken something from you, instead of giving you the truth." "You have taken something from me," she said, the words coming faster now, unplanned, pulled loose by weeks of confusion, finally finding a shape to attach itself to. "I came here with nothing, Callum. No family, no name, no claim to anything, and the one thing I had left that was entirely mine was my voice, something my mother gave me before she died, something I never once thought of as belonging to anyone but myself. And now you're telling me it was never just mine at all, that it belongs to some instinct in your pack I never agreed to be part of." "Ivy, I need to think," she said, stepping back from him before his hand could reach for her again, before the warmth of it could soften the edges of everything she was suddenly and overwhelmingly afraid of. "Please, just let me think." He let her go. She would remember that later, turning the 11 days and the quiet minutes and this moment over and over in her mind, how he had let her go without argument, without the plain and simple authority a king could have used to keep her rooted in place, because some part of him understood, even through his own fear of losing her, that she needed the space to decide this for herself, whatever the deciding cost either of them. She lay in her narrow cot with the shutter bolted and stared at the ceiling, replaying every gathered wolf, every stolen conversation, every careful, unguarded look Callum had given her since the night she spilled a tray of broth across her own kitchen floor, and tried to separate what she felt for the man from what her voice apparently called to in his pack without her permission, and found, to her own quiet frustration, that she could not draw a clean line between the two at all. Grace found her the next morning hollow-eyed over the wash basin, scrubbing the same pot longer than it needed. "You look like you haven't slept," Grace said. "I haven't. Want to tell me why?" Ivy considered it, then found, surprising herself, that she did. She told Grace everything, the wolves and the recognition, and the word Callum had finally said plainly, after weeks of circling it, "mate," a word that still sat strangely in her chest, like a coat 2 sizes too large. Grace listened without interrupting, her sharp eyes softening somewhere in the middle of it, into something gentler than Ivy had ever seen from her. "You're allowed to be angry that he waited," Grace said finally. "But don't let the anger convince you the whole thing is a lie. Wolves don't call to just anyone, Ivy. Whatever instinct is doing this, it isn't picking a random girl to inconvenience a king with. It's answering something that was already there. How do you know that?" "Because I've watched you talk about him," Grace said. "Since the first night you mentioned mud on your kitchen floor, you've lit up like a struck match every time his name comes up, and you didn't need a pack of wolves to convince you of a single word of it." Ivy did not answer, because there was nothing honest she could say that would not confirm exactly what Grace had just observed, and some part of her, tired and frightened and lonelier than she wanted to admit, was grateful someone else had said it plainly so she did not have to. It was 3 days later, with the silence between her and Callum stretched thin but not yet broken, that Finn arrived at the kitchen door with a face grim enough to stop every conversation in the room. "Where is he?" Ivy asked, already knowing from Finn's expression that something had shifted, that the careful 11 days of quiet had run out of road. "Council chamber," Finn said. "Silas has sent a formal message. He knows about the pack's interest in a human servant, knows enough of it to call it weakness in writing, and he has given the king 3 days to prove otherwise or expect a challenge at the border in force." Finn's eyes found Ivy's, steady and serious. "He mentioned you by name, Ivy. Whatever silence we tried to buy these past 11 days, it wasn't enough. He already knew exactly what he was looking for." The cold that moved through Ivy's chest at those words was unlike anything she had felt since the very first night wolves gathered outside her window, because this fear was not for herself alone anymore. It was for a stronghold full of people who had never asked to have their safety tied to a kitchen girl's voice, for a king who had spent years building an iron discipline around exactly this kind of vulnerability, for a pack of wolves who had done nothing more than answer an instinct they could not control, all of them now standing, because of her, at the edge of something that no longer felt like a private matter of hearts and recognition, but a danger with teeth of its own, sharpening itself against the whole of their lives. "Take me to him," Ivy said, and Finn, reading something new and resolved in her face, did not argue, only turned and led the way, the 11 days of silence finally, irrevocably, breaking apart behind them both. The council chamber fell silent the moment Ivy walked through its doors, a dozen faces turning toward her with expressions ranging from surprise to open disapproval, Councillor Bryant's among the sharpest of them all. Callum stood at the head of the long table, a folded letter in his hand, and whatever exhaustion or worry he had carried into the room vanished the instant he saw her, replaced by something steadier, something that looked almost like relief. "Ivy," he said. "This isn't—" "I heard," she said. "All of it. Finn told me on the way." Bryant cleared his throat, the sound deliberately loud enough to reclaim the room's attention. "Your Majesty, whatever affection you carry for this girl, Silas has given us 3 days to prove his suspicions false. The only way to do that convincingly is to remove the source of his suspicion from the stronghold entirely, quietly, before he has cause to test our borders in force." "You want to send her away," Callum said, voice flat and dangerous, in a way Ivy had not heard from him before. "I want this pack to survive a war it does not need to fight," Bryant snapped back. There is a difference between cruelty and strategy, Your Majesty, and I would ask you to remember which one currently keeps 400 wolves and everyone in these walls breathing." The room held its breath. Ivy felt every eye in the chamber shift toward her, weighing her, measuring the cost of her presence against the safety of people who had never chosen to have their fate tangled up with hers, and for one terrible moment, she understood exactly what it must feel like to be a liability. The word Grace had first repeated to her weeks ago, landing now with its full and unforgiving weight. "I won't run," Ivy said, and her voice, though quiet, carried clearly enough that every conversation in the chamber died at once. "I understand what you're afraid of, Counselor. I understand it better than you think, but sending me away doesn't remove the reason Silas is testing this border. It only tells him his instincts were right, that this pack has a weakness worth exploiting, one that ran the moment he pushed on it. That won't buy you peace. It will buy you a war fought from a position of proven fear instead of strength." Bryant's mouth opened, then closed, clearly unprepared for a kitchen girl to argue strategy in a council chamber. "Then what do you propose?" he said, recovering, though his tone had shifted slightly, less dismissive now. "I don't know yet," Ivy admitted, "but I know that hiding what I am hasn't worked for 11 days, and it won't work for 3 more either. Silas already knows. The only thing left to decide is whether we face that knowledge as something to be ashamed of or something to use." Callum was watching her the way he had watched her in the garden weeks ago, as though she kept surprising him in ways he had long since stopped expecting from the world, and something in his expression, warm and fierce and entirely unguarded now in front of the whole council, told Ivy that whatever fear had driven their silence these past 11 days, it had just quietly, irrevocably ended. "She stays," Callum said, to the room at large, in a voice that allowed no further argument, "and we prepare for Silas's arrival, not as a pack hiding a weakness, but as one standing behind exactly what it claims to protect." The 3 days that followed moved faster than any Ivy had lived through, the stronghold humming with the particular controlled urgency of preparation for a threat that had a face and a name now instead of a shapeless fear in the dark. Finn drilled the border guard until exhaustion blurred their edges. Nora, practical as ever, organized the kitchens to feed a pack on constant alert. Grace stayed close to Ivy through it all, a steady presence when the weight of everything threatened to become too much to carry alone. On the morning of the 3rd day, the scouts came running with word that Silas's forces had been sighted at the eastern tree line, a war party larger than a simple border test, larger than anything meant merely to prove a point. Callum met Ivy in the courtyard as the pack gathered, wolves and warriors both assembling along the wall in grim, silent rows, the same wall where, weeks before, they had gathered only to listen to a girl sing songs about fishermen's daughters and ships that never came home. "I want you inside," Callum said, though there was no real command in it, only the plain, desperate hope of a man who understood he could not actually make her disappear from danger, even if he tried. "I won't hide in a kitchen while people fight over what I might mean to this pack," Ivy said. "I've spent my whole life being small and unseen, because that felt safer. I'm done deciding that's the only way to survive." Before Callum could argue further, the tree line beyond the eastern wall shifted, and Silas's forces came into view, a wall of wolves and armed men advancing with the slow, deliberate confidence of an army that expected an easy victory. At their head walked a pale, lean wolf that shifted mid-stride into a tall man with cold eyes and an expression of open contempt, the same stranger Ivy had glimpsed watching from the tree line weeks before. "Callum Ashford," Silas called across the field between them, his voice carrying easily in the morning air. "I had heard rumors of a king distracted by a servant girl's voice. I confess I did not believe it until my own scout confirmed it with his eyes. A pack led by instinct instead of discipline is a pack ripe for the taking." "You've traveled 2 days to test a rumor," Callum called back, his voice steady, carrying none of the private fear Ivy had watched cross his face in quiet moments over the past weeks. "I'd think a man as careful as you claims to be would have better use of his time." I've traveled 2 days to claim what a weakened border leaves undefended, Silas said. Give me the girl as proof you understand exactly how vulnerable your pack has become, and perhaps I'll consider this border tested rather than broken. A ripple of low growls moved through the assembled wolves at Silas's words, a sound Ivy felt in her chest more than heard with her ears, and she understood, watching Callum's jaw tighten and his hands curl slowly into fists at his sides, that whatever careful diplomacy either king might have preferred, this confrontation had already moved past the point where words alone would settle it. It was in that moment, with two armies of wolves and warriors facing each other across a stretch of trampled grass, and the whole weight of the stronghold's future balanced on a single tense breath, that Ivy understood what she had to do. She stepped forward, past Callum's outstretched arm, past Finn's sharp warning look, out into the open space between the two forces where every eye, human and wolf alike, could see her clearly. "Ivy," Callum said, low and urgent, "what are you doing?" "The one thing I actually know how to do," she said, and before fear could talk her out of it, before the weight of every watching eye could shrink her back into the small, careful girl who scrubbed pots and stayed silent, she opened her mouth and sang. It was not a soft song this time, not the gentle tune about a fisherman's daughter she hummed over dishwater. It rose instead, clear and strong and utterly without apology, carrying across the field in a way that made even Silas's advancing line falter mid-stride. Every wolf on Callum's side of the field turned toward her at once, the sound moving through them like something physical, steadying rows that had begun to bristle with fear into something closer to unshakable resolve. And on the other side of the field, Silas's own pack faltered too, ears turning, hackles smoothing despite their alpha's furious command to hold position, some instinct in them recognizing the call even though it was never meant for them at all. "Whatever this is," Silas snarled, rounding on his own hesitating wolves, "it is a trick, nothing more." "It isn't a trick," Callum said, stepping up beside Ivy without hesitation, his voice carrying across the field with the full weight of his rule behind it. "It's exactly what you accused me of, Silas, a pack bound by instinct instead of fear alone. You called that weakness. I call it the only kind of strength that survives a war worth winning." Ivy's song did not falter, rising instead, and beside her the pack she had unknowingly called to for weeks now answered not with confusion or distraction, but with something that looked, to every watching eye on that field, remarkably like unity. 400 wolves standing steady around a girl who had once believed her only inheritance was a voice worth hiding. Silas's forces, faced with a line that refused to break and an instinct in their own ranks pulling unmistakably toward the very voice they had come to exploit, hesitated long enough for the moment to tip entirely out of his favor. He held his ground only a few breaths longer before the calculation on his face shifted, some grudging recognition passing behind his cold eyes that this border, tested as he had intended, had proven far sturdier than the weakness he came looking for. "This isn't finished," Silas said, retreating a step, then another, his own pack falling back with him more readily than he seemed to like. "Instinct is not loyalty, Ashford. A voice can call, it cannot hold. Then come test that theory again whenever you like," Callum said. "You'll find the answer hasn't changed." Silas's forces withdrew across the field and back into the tree line, the confrontation ending not with the violence everyone had braced for, but with a retreat born of recalculated odds, and the moment the last of Silas's wolves vanished into the distant trees, the tension holding the stronghold's own line snapped loose all at once, breaths released, shoulders dropping, a ragged cheer rising somewhere near the wall that spread quickly through the gathered ranks. Ivy's song faded into silence, and she became aware, all at once, of how loudly her own heart was pounding, of Callum's hand finding hers in the aftermath, warm and solid, and no longer careful or hesitant at all. "You could have been killed," he said, quiet, for her ears only. "So could you," she said. "Every day, apparently, long before I ever arrived to complicate things further. Something that might have been a laugh, tired and disbelieving and entirely relieved, escaped him. "I don't think complicate is the word I'd choose." "What word would you choose?" He considered her for a long moment, the whole stronghold settling into noisy, relieved chaos around them, wolves shifting back into human forms, warriors embracing one another, Nora already shouting orders about feeding everyone who had just faced down a war and lived to be hungry afterward. "Home," Callum said finally. "I'd choose home." Ivy did not have an answer ready for that, not one made of words at least, so she simply let her hand stay in his, standing in the same courtyard where wolves had once gathered, simply to listen, now standing instead, because they had chosen, instinct and heart together, to belong to something worth defending. That evening, with the stronghold settling into the exhausted, grateful quiet that follows any danger survived, rather than merely avoided, Ivy stood once more at the kitchen window, shutter thrown wide open for the first time in 11 days, and sang, not out of habit, not out of loneliness, but because she finally understood the song was never a secret she needed to protect. It was an invitation, and for the first time since her mother's voice had gone silent, Ivy no longer felt afraid of who might answer it. Outside, along the courtyard wall, the pack gathered once more in the moonlight, patient and unhurried, no longer strangers straining to understand a pull they could not name, but a family, settling in around the voice that had, without either asking or apologizing for it, finally called them all the way home,